that's kind of a good segue into the other reason why I wanted to have you on, because you are passionate about games, and I actually reached out to you after you had tweeted something about games preservation. I was like, man, we've never really talked about games preservation on the podcast. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Nintendo announcing that they're shutting down the Wii U and 3DS stores in 2023. That's kind of a problem, because it's like, well, what's going to happen, with the games? So, from your perspective as someone who's been, gaming as long as you have, you know, I guess, let's start here, because there's probably, I'd imagine there's a group of our listeners who, when they hear games preservation, they've probably never heard this phrase before. So how would you describe games preservation to someone who maybe isn't really familiar with the topic?
Yeah. So games preservation in itself can kind of be confusing, I think, for a lot of people, because they're thinking like, well, what do you mean by preserving it? What are you talking about?
Right.
Where is the game going somewhere? What's going to happen to it? And that's essentially exactly what it is you're trying to make sure that a game remains both accessible and playable, in perpetuity. So you don't want to put like a timestamp on it and say, okay, a game is going to be available only for this set audience within this set time period. And then after that, it's either going to become inaccessible or unplayable for people.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with that is that video games, of course, have to be stored on some type of media, physical media, whether that's a hard drive, or if you even want to go back, to the earliest game consoles and the way that games originally were programmed, they were programmed to be placed onto cartridges, which would then go into, video game consoles and run within a console natively. Or for video games that were computer software, those would get installed onto the local hard drive or whatever your computer hardware was, and then played off of that, right?
Mm-hmm.
The problem is that all of those are subject to decay.
Right.
And that decay, if I remember correctly, the technical term for that decay is something that's called bit rot, BIT. That's the first word, and then rot,
okay.
ROT. And essentially what that means is that physical media is going to degrade over time and eventually become unusable. So, the video game cartridge, my old NES cartridges that I have or whatever, eventually at some point, those are going to break down and decay to the point to where they are no longer playable. And what that means then is that whatever is on there in terms of the coding, for it to remain accessible and playable for everyone in perpetuity, well on into the future, decades into the future, that code is going to have to be transferred onto something else that is then usable and playable for others in the future. If it remains just on that physical game cartridge that I have, then it's eventually going to be lost, because it's going to decay to the point that it becomes unplayable. And that goes for whatever you're talking about. If you're dealing with magnetic hard drives, that's eventually going to catch up with those, right? If you're dealing with solid state hard drives, same thing there. It's going to happen to cartridges. It's going to happen to CD-ROMs. It's going to happen to DVDs. It's going to happen to Blu-rays. Any physical media is subject to decay. And over time, eventually, it's going to reach the point to where it's no longer playable. So because of that, again, the coding has to be transferred over to other physical media in order for it to remain playable and accessible in the future. So that's what the effort of preservation is, right? It's trying to find a way that these games don't ultimately get completely lost, because the code of the games is able to be transferred from one physical medium to another in order for it to remain playable and accessible. But that then brings up the problem, which is sort of the main thorn in the flesh, if you will, for game preservation efforts, which is U.S. copyright law and the way that publishers wield it. And so that's kind of its own separate issue within preservation. I'll stop here because I don't want to monopolize, the time in answering the question. Kind of, if you have a follow-up to that, I'm happy to talk about that some more too.
Well, no, I'm actually glad that you brought up the U.S. copyright stuff, because, a long, long time ago in TRG's back library of episodes, we did one on like ROMs, and we tried to look through copyright law, and we tried to look through what, is it legal to have a ROM or to have an emulator and all that jazz. And man, it's from what I remember, it's kind of confusing, and it's not super clear. Like the best thing I think we ever got was we determined that it is legal to have a ROM of a game as long as you own like the physical version of the game, because emulators themselves are not illegal. That's just a software that allows it to read the code and play it on a particular system. But the ROM, the source file of the game, maybe not the source file, but the ROM file of the game itself is what's in question. And I don't know. I don't even know if that's still accurate, because I've had people tell me that that's inaccurate. That's not in line with U.S. copyright law, and I'm like, man, what even is this? So it feels like it's hard to really kind of parse out what it is, and I don't know if maybe you can kind of speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, I can. So interestingly, for the listeners who don't know, I am the director of library services at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary. So I also have a master's degree in library science. And one of the courses that I took as part of that degree, I specifically took a course on U.S. copyright law as it applies to libraries, because libraries deal with these issues, a lot in terms of, whether or not it's okay to make copies of materials for people, and, how much, and what do you do in terms of archives and preservation and all that, that gets wrapped into U.S. copyright law. U.S. copyright law actually allows anyone to make a copy of whatever the item is that they have, to serve as a backup, so long as it is a personal backup that is not going to be distributed to others.
Okay.
So it's not illegal for me or for you or for anyone else, for example, to take a game that exists on a cartridge and make a copy of the ROM file to have as a backup for eventually whenever that cartridge decays or becomes unplayable or something like that. It's not illegal to do that. It is illegal for you to take that ROM file and put it on the internet for other people to download and play.
Yeah.
That is illegal, and that is a violation of U.S. copyright law, but it is not illegal for you to make a backup copy for yourself in case you need it, right? So that is fine. Assuming that, and the way that the law works and everything is you're making that backup copy specifically for the purpose because the media that you are using, or that the media that you own, is subject to decay, or that it's already begun the process of decaying and eventually becoming unplayable, or it's damaged in some form, that kind of thing. So that is allowable in terms of you having that for yourself. It's just whenever you get into the distribution of it for others that you run afoul of copyright law, and the reasons that is the case is because the copyright owner, it's possible for it to have a market effect on them. So, for example, if I have my ROM file and I'm distributing that to others on the internet, that's making available for free something that would normally be something that a person has to pay for in order to access and to play. And so that has an impact, if you will, a market impact for the publisher, because I am giving away for free that which they are trying to sell to someone. And so that's illegal. They have the ability to sue me for damages in that respect. But in terms of me having a copy for myself, that's not illegal. The problem then, when it comes to game preservation efforts, is that the publishers tend to sort of use copyright law as sort of like a cudgel, if you will, whenever it comes to individuals who are trying to preserve video games. And they're trying to come after them and saying, no, you don't have a right to make a copy of our files or the ROMs or, the coding itself. You don't have the ability, or you don't have the right, rather, to make a copy for preservation purposes, because that might potentially impact our business in some manner. And so the problem is, when it comes to game preservation efforts, when the publishers start wielding their lawyers against game preservationists, of course, the game preservationists are going to back down, because you're dealing with like billion-dollar companies who are willing to spend whatever money they can, when it comes to a lawsuit or something like that. Whereas, truthfully and honestly, I honestly think that if at some point a video game publisher were to actually go through with a lawsuit against video game preservationists, and the video game preservationists had enough legal firepower behind them, they would actually win out in court. I think
Yeah.
assuming that they could prove that they were not going to distribute it to others, and that it was just simply a matter of preserving it for research purposes and for other legitimate purposes that are not going to be violations of U.S. copyright law. The problem is that no one is in a position to do that. These are
Right.
all relatively small time, if you will,
Yeah.
compared to these big billion-dollar corporations that can basically push people around.
Yeah. And as you kind of were sitting there talking about it, I was reminded of, and I can't remember the name of the website specifically. They're more of just like kind of just cataloging games and just kind of like giving information about them versus what they used to. They used to have ROMs on there that you could download of the games, but then Nintendo did some kind of cease and desist. I think actually came close to suing them, if I remember correctly. And so I just was reminded of that it doesn't really have much of a bearing on this. I was just, kind of sharing a little bit of something I remembered. But when it comes to this, I can imagine that there's probably some listeners that are listening to this and going, well, why do games necessarily need to be preserved, right? I mean, games are kind of a luxury item. It's like, we're not really owed that these games we're not really owed that these games need to stay playable in perpetuity or anything like that. So I guess kind of what is the case for games preservation? Does it kind of presuppose that games are art and they need to be preserved on that particular factor as well as others? Or maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say so. Even if you're not going to view them from the perspective of games being art, they are still significant enough cultural artifacts that they would need to be preserved in the same way that others would. Now, when you think of something like books, for instance, right? And I speak from this perspective in terms of me being a professional librarian. When it comes to books, those have, longevity, right? We have books in our collection at the library at Midwestern that date all the way back to the 1600s, right?
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah, they may be degrading to a certain extent, right? They're not in the same condition that they were back when they were originally published, and the pages maybe, starting to fall apart in some instances, or the ink quality has faded over time, different things like that. It's still nonetheless preserved over a very lengthy period of time, right? It's survived for centuries up to the point that we have it now in our library, right? Something that was originally published back in the 1600s to now, that's quite a feat in terms of I can literally flip open the pages and read the exact same text that somebody who owned that book in the 1600s would have read, because it's there, right? I mean, it's been preserved. That's relatively straightforward and easy because of the material of which books are made, in terms of, the paper, the ink, the binding, and things like that. Those are things that generally, they will degrade over time and eventually will reach the point where they degrade completely, but it's a very slow degradation. Right. So therefore, we're able to have it in relatively, good condition, speaking in terms, again, relatively, because we're talking about hundreds of years here, but going over hundreds of years, it's remarkable that the book is in relatively good condition and is still able to be read, that kind of thing. That's not the case when it comes to digital media and things, that even analog media that are electronic in nature and are much more prone to breaking down much faster than something as simple as a book. So all that to say, if you think of books as being worthy of preservation, and I think most people would, the idea of losing every single copy out there of a classic text, let's say, I don't know, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, right? Something like that. So imagine, a world in which we might possibly lose Pilgrim's Progress and no one will ever be able to access the original text of Pilgrim's Progress, because every single copy of it from the past will have eventually degraded to the point to where there are no copies anymore that are readable. We would think, well, that sounds absurd, right? Because Pilgrim's Progress has been published over and over again, by all these other published. I can go pick up a copy that was published last year, right, from some press or whatever, and it's a brand new, fresh copy that's also going to last, a very long time. We would say something like that is absurd sounding, right? Because like, oh, well, we would never reach that point. Well, that's not the case when it comes to games, because in a very real sense, every single copy of a game will eventually degrade to a point, and by that I mean, like, let's think of a game on cartridges, Super Mario Brothers, for instance. And let's say that Super Mario Brothers had never been ported by Nintendo to any other later console or anything like that, and all that existed were just the original cartridges with the original code on, the original ROMs within the cartridge itself. Eventually, over time, every single one of those cartridges would degrade to the point to where it became unplayable. And if that was the case, and we just let that happen, then the code, therefore the game of Super Mario Brothers, would be lost forever to history. No one would be able to go back and play the original game. Now, of course, Nintendo has ported it multiple times, and they've profited from that too, right? In terms of what they've sold it and resold it in different formats over and over again on the various Nintendo consoles as part of the console family, when you progress over time. So something like that's never going to happen with that game specifically. But there are games out there that have never been ported that are still on the original cartridges. And if no one had ever ripped the ROMs off of those to preserve them, then eventually we'd reach a point where every single one of those cartridges became unplayable and the game would be forever lost to history. So game preservationists don't want that to happen, right? They don't want to see that happen to the games. They want the games to be available for everyone historically on into the future to be able to access and to be able to play. So as a matter of making sure that that happens, they are basically pulling the ROMs off of these cartridges and other game code and trying to save that game code so that it exists in a playable format for others to access and play, well into the future. That's kind of my general overview there. Yeah.
Well, no, that's good. And it just kind of like the more I think about it, it's just kind of, I guess for me, because I very much would probably lean more on the side of like, games should be preserved because some of the, I mean, it's like you said, the cultural significance of some of these games is huge. Like you even think about like Chrono Trigger, which is a game that I've tried multiple times to get into. I even bought a cartridge off eBay and have a backup of it. Thanks to this retro device that I have that allowed me to make the copy. I'm pretty sure that cartridge that I got, as good of condition as it's in, it probably won't last a whole lot longer. And so it's just, it's weird for me to think that some of these companies, I guess, I don't know, maybe you can correct me on this or maybe you agree, but it seems like some of these companies just don't get or don't understand what they have to a degree. And this is kind of fresh in my mind when I look at Nintendo because of what they announced today. And it made me laugh a little bit reading their response that they actually pulled this from their website where they posted a question that says, once it being the games on the Wii or 3DS shop are no longer possible to purchase in the eShop, many classic games for past platforms will cease to be available for purchase anywhere. Will Nintendo make classic games available to own some other way? If not, then why? Doesn't Nintendo have an obligation to preserve its classic games by continually making them available for purchase? And the responses they gave was 3 bullet points that said, across our Nintendo Switch Online membership plans, over 130 classic games are currently available in growing libraries for various legacy systems. The games are often enhanced with new features such as online play, that's a whole other thing I won't get into here. The next bullet point reads, we think this is an effective way to make classic content easily available to a broad range of players. Within these libraries, new and longtime players can not only find games they remember or have heard about, but other fun games they might not have thought to seek out otherwise, which I can't agree because the Switch online playing does have some pretty off-the-wall surprising additions there that are actually pretty good. And then the last bullet point here says, we currently have no plans to offer classic content in other ways. And so for me reading that, someone who grew up in Nintendo's games and admittedly has a lot of nostalgia for them, but also understands that there's a lot of classic games that had a pretty big cultural significance, not just for me, but just society as a whole. I read this and go, Nintendo, are you guys tone deaf?
Yeah.
And I think it says something that they had to pull that from their website because I don't know, man. When you look at game companies, the ones that aren't necessarily committed to, or I should say, probably not necessarily committed to proper games preservation. Um, like, how do you receive that stuff, or how do you perceive kind of the actions or inactions of some of these companies?
Yeah, I mean, there is a sense in which that's relatively tone deaf on Nintendo's part. And the way that I would illustrate that is to say that when it comes to games, we'll just take, random so and so game that was a digital only release on the 3DS eShop, right?
Mm-hmm.
The only way that game was ever accessed by anyone, and let's say it's a game that was exclusive to 3DS eShop and was never ported over to any other console,
mm-hmm.
that game is only available on eShop. It is only playable on a 3DS. So if there is a game like that, and I'm assuming there is on the eShop, once the eShop ceases to function and Nintendo shuts that down, and that game is no longer purchasable, that means that copies of that game on existing 3DS systems that people have downloaded are going to be the only way that game can ever be played, unless someone is able to, use like a homebrewed 3DS and pull that file and make it playable through an emulator, which I'm sure somebody probably has.
Sure, yeah.
But assuming that no one had done that, then those, or whatever that game is, would eventually cease to exist, because everyone's 3DS system is going to break down at some point.
Yep.
And when it does, that game is going to be lost. So for every system that downloaded that game and had it stored on there, that game would eventually become unplayable. And then once that would happen to every single system that had that game, then that game gets lost forever. So that's essentially, the argument that game preservationists are making is, we are doing a sort of a duty, if you will, to society by going in and, say, like hacking systems, being able to homebrew stuff so that we're able to actually pull the code of those games and preserve those games. We're doing it for the right reasons. We're not doing it to pirate. We're not doing it to, send that out to everyone for free. We're doing it because we're trying to preserve the game, because the game companies themselves are not interested in preserving it themselves and making it available, for future generations. So a classic example of this that I don't know to what extent, listeners might be familiar with it already. Some of them may be. But, the classic example of this is whenever Square Enix was going to do the Final Fantasy VIII remaster. And I don't know if you've heard the story.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring this up.
Yeah. So, I mean, it came to the point to where they were needing to do the Final Fantasy VIII remaster, but Square Enix lost the source code for Final Fantasy VIII. They didn't preserve it. So because they didn't preserve the source code, they were having to go back and pull, the various resources, for the game. I'm trying to think of the exact term. It's not coming to mind. But essentially, everything that they would need, from the sprites to the backgrounds and everything, stuff, they were having to basically sort of cobble that together. That would be different.
Sorry, that would be like called the assets, right?
Yeah,
or something
the assets.
like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So they were having to cobble together the game assets from different places in order to put together a remaster, because they didn't save the source code themselves. And just something like that is just mind-blowing, right? Where it's like, you're the company who made the game. How could you not have preserved the source code for your own game that you made? And it's just because game companies, they haven't had that mentality. They've had the mentality of producing games for fun and for profit. And, they're running a business. And so they're not thinking in terms of, this is actually a cultural artifact that is worth saving and preserving for future generations. So to the extent that Nintendo is shutting down the eShop, I would say, I hope they save the source code for all the games, that are on there. But who knows whether they are or not. They don't. I mean, sure, I think if I remember from the statement that you read, they were saying something and kind of throwing everyone a bone, if you will, by saying, oh, well, the Nintendo Switch subscription service allows, access to classic games. Well, yeah, it does, but it's curated, so Nintendo is selecting which games to put on the service and which ones to leave off. So you're not getting access to everything. So, of course, not every game that's part of the 3DS library is going to make its way onto future availability via the Nintendo Switch, subscription service. So all that to say, I take that to mean that Nintendo is not all that serious about preservation of those games. Yeah.
And it's such a shame too, because and I don't want to like, sound like a broken record here, but it's just like there's so many games within Nintendo's library across their systems that are left dormant and isolated on those systems. Like 2 years ago, when COVID was going on, I was like, man, there's not a whole lot to play. I'm going to start collecting GameCube games. But man, the trying to get GameCube games is relatively easy depending on what you're going for. But at the same time, it is insanely expensive. And it left me wondering that entire year. I'm like, why doesn't Nintendo just take some of these games, at least their first party games, and move them over to the Switch? It doesn't even have to be like a remaster or something. Give me the 4:3 ratio. I'll take that as long as I can play it. But it's just it's weird to me, and I guess I understand to a degree one perspective that would say that we're not really owed this kind of thing. But on the other hand, it's like this. A lot of these games, this is Nintendo's history, or Capcom's history, or Sega's history, PlayStation, whatever publisher you can think of. And for them to not take steps or put forth effort to preserve these games, this part of their history, really, to me, I feel like it's a disservice to their own history and their own heritage, to a degree, and it deprives new gamers that experience of experiencing those games. And I guess we could probably go back and forth on this. I'm sure me and you both are pretty much on the side of like, games should be preserved for a long time. But it's just, I don't know, man. I look at this and it's just weird to me, because if I was a Nintendo, I'd be taking those classic games and putting them on every new console, or trying to find some way to carry those games over from your previous systems to the current one, which is why I love PC so much. I'm able to play so many old, like I talked earlier about playing through the Trails in the Sky games. Those games came out early 2000 or something, I think, on the Vita. And it's just like, if they hadn't been moved over to the Steam, I wouldn't be able to play them. Persona 4 Golden is another one I can think of, but it seems like Atlas is taking steps to bring their old games to current systems to allow people to play them and experience their heritage. And I don't know, it's weird to me to just see these companies, I guess, not and maybe it's not that they don't understand it, but from my perspective, it seems like they don't understand their heritage or the importance of preserving it. I don't know if you would agree with that or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's ultimately what it boils down to. Is most of these video game publishers, they exist as publicly owned corporations. Mm-hmm. And so because of that, they see their ultimate duty as to the shareholders of their companies rather than to, say, society. Now, it's not to say that like Nintendo is not interested in producing fun experiences for people, or that Nintendo does not want people to genuinely enjoy their video games, because right. Of course they do. They wouldn't be making video games if they didn't. Exactly. But at the same time, they are also trying to make a profit, right? They don't give away their games for free. They sell them. So they're going to make money, and they have in mind to make money, and they view their job as making money by making video games and selling them to people. And so when that's your bottom line, and you're always focused on what's coming next and what's going to bring in the next dollar, which, don't get me wrong, you have to be focused on that as a company, right. Because otherwise you'll cease to exist. If you aren't selling enough games and turning a profit, then eventually, the company goes under. So you have to focus on that. But at the same time, what I think there needs to be is a balance between the two, right? In terms of, yes, we do need to create new content. Yes, we do need to create new games. We need to be profitable as a company. But at the same time, recognizing the importance that games have in society as cultural artifacts, we need to do everything that we can to assist preservationists in preservation efforts if we ourselves are not going to be interested in preserving our own games ourselves, right? It's like, if you don't have the bandwidth to do that, or even the interest in doing that, at least be lenient enough in terms of copyright enforcement and things like that, that you're allowing other people to do that for you, for whom that is a passion, and who are going to pour in the energy and the attention that something like that needs. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I was even thinking like, why don't some of these, and again, I don't know what kind of paperwork and hoops they would have to jump through to do this, but I was even thinking, why don't, take Nintendo, for example, why don't they just hire a group of people who are really passionate about preserving things and just bring them on, or hire them on a contract basis or something, and be like, hey, for this set amount of time, here's our games, preserve them as best as you can and help us out with this. So, maybe we can port them over later or whatever it may be, but just something at least, but it is what it is. So with that being said, I mean, we are recording this episode midway through February. So who knows, maybe by the time this episode releases to public feeds, Nintendo will, after releasing that particular FAQ for what they're doing with shutting down the stores, they'll have just ported a bunch of Wii U games and 3DS games over to the Switch. And, this conversation might be a little moot in some areas, but one can hope and dream. So we'll just have to wait and see, I guess.